Chapter 12. Mayan Temple 4. Lionel awoke with his body on fire, the slight whiff of something catching his attention. The smell made his stomach growl furiously, his mouth almost dripping with water despite how dry it felt. Lionel didn't know how his friends were being sustained, but he did know that he hadn't felt the need for water until he woke up. And, now that it had been over 4 days since the last time he ate, he finally couldn't suppress his hunger anymore. It was only then that Lionel realized that the Spaniards had been roasting a full pig when he initially entered. He must have not smelled anything before, because it had just started to cook. Lionel struggled to pull himself up, peeling all the heavy armor he wore from his body. He hadn't felt this light in a very long time. Luckily, since there was no one to tend to the fire, the embers had died off while Lionel slept, sparing the pig from being overcooked. It was inevitable that it was still burnt in some places, especially since no one had been there to turn it, but Lionel could hardly bother to care. He ripped off a leg, devouring the meat madly. Initially, he had believed that a leg or two would be enough, but before he realized what was happening, he had already cleaned away half of the pig. Lionel had always been a big eater, but it was always within reason. Something like eating half of a 20-kilogram pig was far beyond his means. "I want you to find that damned entrance. There's no way that Barbarian entered from the front. There must be a hidden entrance. Look at how many of our people those savages have killed." Words Lionel couldn't understand drifted from the hidden entrance. It became obvious quickly that he didn't have much time. All those who saw him come out of the hidden staircase were already dead. But it was only a matter of time before they started looking for false walls. Because Lionel had knocked down the false wall on this side without replacing it, it was much easier to hear things than it had been in the past. Moving quickly, Lionel replaced his armor with that of the dead leaders. He was going to pour some more alcohol on his wounds first, but he was shocked to find that many of them had faded. In fact, the aches in his body from his torn muscles had become quite dull as well. Ah, food. It must be food. "You need meow?" Lionel bit his lip. Where else would he get food so easily? There was no point in carrying this pig with him because it would go bad in at most a few more days. Plus, considering the pace at which he ate it, it wouldn't last that long either. The only option is to continue to steal food or to leave this temple. Lionel couldn't come up with the perfect choice now. He had to hurry. "I came here for there it is, the atlatl." "Ninimal." Atlatls were essentially slingshots for throwing spears. They were a wooden attachment one could slot a spear or long dart into to gain more leverage. Then, using the same throwing motion one was used to, it was possible to throw more than double the distance and with much more speed and force. To think such a thing was invented over 20 years ago, even before the era of the Mayans. Lionel abandoned his hand axes, using the belt he had stolen from a Spaniard to slip in a few atlatls. Considering they were reusable, it was unnecessary to have more than one. However, Lionel had learned to plan for the unexpected. He kept 4 atlatls with him on one hip and strapped a short sword on the other. He would have taken the leader's long sword, but he had his reasons for not. Along the walls, countless barrels of throwing spears fitted for the atlatls. Well, to call them spears was a bit inappropriate. They looked like sturdy arrows one might fire from a large-scaled crossbow. However, Lionel obviously couldn't carry them all. He realized after carrying around his 30-pound silver rod for so long that his body's limits were far higher than they had been previously. However, it wasn't to an exaggerated extent. Thinking to this point, Lionel chose a square backpack shaped of wood. It was about 1.5 meters in length, and by Lionel's estimations could hold about 50 atlatls, darts, or spears. He filled it quickly. His initial instinct was to try and overfill it, but he knew this would be foolish. If he failed to pull out a spear at a critical time, it would be too late to regret it. "Let's test it." "You not may." Lionel took out one of his atlatls, fitting an extra spear to it. He held its handle like a javelin. The spear sat atop the atlatls. As for the atlatls itself, it attached to the end of the spear, allowing it to sit upon it. The body of the atlatls, which Lionel held, curved back around like an S's drawn much too tall and lanky. Flexing his arm, Lionel bowed his body and launched the spear. But the results left him stunned silent. The metal tip of the spear stuck into the stone wall, vibrating back and forth wildly. It covered at a 20-meter distance in 0.4 seconds. That's an average velocity of 50 meters per second or 180 kilometers an hour. It was even still accelerating when it hit the wall, so it still had more left. The effective range is easily anything within 200-meter saws. Lionel sucked in a cold breath. First, he was surprised at his sharp calculations, but he was even more surprised at just how much the Atlatls improved his throwing ability. Such a simple technology, yet so effective. Snapping out of his stupor, Lionel ripped the 1.5-meter-long dart from the wall and hid it within the barrels of spears. In case the Spaniards made it to this room again, he didn't want them to be able to figure out his limits. After that, he dug deep and lifted the stone that covered the hidden entrance back up and into its place. This way they wouldn't be able to tell which path he came from. Of course, he only did this after retrieving the last third of his silver rod. That was right. Lionel had already found another hidden entrance in this very room. In fact, he counted a total of 5. It could only be said that the Spanish were too negligent. Either that, or his senses were simply too sharp. Following this, Lionel left through the hidden pathway with the least activity on the other side, slipping away to unleash hell on the Spaniards. In the following weeks, he mapped every floor of the temple with the exception of the lowest, which he believed must have housed the sacrificial room. As time passed, Lionel's senses grew sharper. He could hear footsteps from further away, and from those footsteps he could tell everything from the height of the soldier in question to their weight. At the same time, his control over his body reached great heights. He no longer threw with his full power every time, only using just enough to maintain his stamina and slay his opponent. About 2 days after he left the weaponry, he did manage to find a path outside. Once he had mapped out the hidden pathways he could use to reach it, he exited frequently, hunting for his own meals before returning. He realized that he simply had no chance fighting the Spaniards from the outside. Without the ability to take advantage of guerrilla tactics, it was a futile effort. Unfortunately, as time passed, the Spaniards grew more and more wary, making it difficult for Lionel to find small groups to attack. As a result, he had no choice but to begin assaults on groups of 4, 5, eventually even groups of 10 were the smallest he could find. However, at the same time his skill grew more pronounced. His throwing ability was already at a near unconscious level, but it was his combat ability that took the greatest leap forward. He learned to keep his movements reserved, yet firm. Simple, yet potent. He had never been formally taught in any martial arts, but as his mind spun and his deductive abilities deepened with his growing senses, he felt as though it didn't matter. With every encounter, a new possibility was stored in his memory. With this additional data point, he would adjust his fighting style ever so slightly to account for it. Months later, Lionel no longer had to rely on his throwing prowess to gain victory against large groups. Even when battling a group of 10 Spaniards, the combination of his inhuman senses and battle experience was enough to take them on. By this point, Lionel was certain that his wristwatch's assessment of him bordered on fraudulent. He wasn't entirely sure how the grading system worked, but if others had higher grade abilities than what he was already able to accomplish, it would be far too exaggerated. Lionel reached a point where with a single glance he was able to categorize his opponent by giving them an athleticism score. He broke down his categories into strength, speed, agility, coordination, and stamina. Strength was simple, just how much power a person could generate. However, with how many different ways strength could be applied, it became incredibly complex. Lionel chose to weigh this category by how much power a person could generate by swinging, throwing, or using their best attack. In this case, it would be how hard a Spaniard could swing their sword or stab their pike. Speed was something Lionel categorized as straight line running velocity. Agility encompassed both acceleration, speed in changing direction, and how quickly a person could use their weapon, how fast a sword swung, etc. Coordination was mostly hand-eye coordination. How precise a person was in using their strength, speed, and agility. How accurate were the swings of their weapons. So on, and so forth. Finally, stamina was the most straightforward. How long could you maintain your optimal fighting strength? Lionel ranked all of these from a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 was having this ability completely crippled and 1 represented the pinnacle of the human race. This pinnacle was something Lionel used the limits of his own body to extrapolate and estimate. By Lionel's estimates, An Olympic athlete of Earth would have a 0.5 in the category they needed the most for their event. As for the Spaniards, they averaged about 0.4 in every category. And Leonela. Strength, 0.67, speed, 0.51, agility, 0.55, coordination, 0.82, stamina, 0.63. After a few more weeks passed, Lionel felt it was necessary to add a sixth category, reactions. Unexpectedly, it ended up being his highest stat, sitting at 0.911. This category not only encompassed reaction speed, but also factored in the instinctual movements battle experience gave you. Of course, most of the reason Lionel's reaction was so high wasn't due to his experience, but because of his inhuman senses. Lionel found that when he broke down his opponents systematically with his self-created method, taking them down became even easier. He shamelessly targeted their weaknesses without remorse. For those with great speed and agility, he overwhelmed them with strength. For those with great strength, he overwhelmed them with speed and agility. For those with great stamina, he left them to last, allowing them to tire themselves out first before he dealt the finishing blow. Before Lionel realized it, he had grown numb to the slaughter. After breaking down their lives to mere numbers floating in his mind, it suddenly became easier to do what needed to be done. At the very least, it became easier to use the excuse that the Spanish committed terrible atrocities in this era to bury his guilt. Emboldened by his growing strength, Lionel began to assault the Spanish from within the temple and in the camps outside under the cover of dark. Their numbers continued to fall quickly. Lionel had no idea how much time he had spent in this subdimensional zone, but it was enough for the Spaniards to start calling him El Diablo. He might not have known much, if any, Spanish, but he definitely knew what that meant. It was a name that let his actions over the last months truly set in. His numbness turned to cold. On yet another seemingly monotonous day, a drastic change finally occurred. With the number of Spaniards drastically lowered, the Mayans holed up within the sacrificial room burst out, leading a mighty counterattack of their own. Lionel watched the battle play out from one of the few small windows he had found in the temple. He felt a wave of relief overcome him. Maybe he would be able to head home soon all. But that was when another question struck him. Did he have a home to return to now? Sighing, Lionel made his way through the network of hidden tunnels. A few had been found by the Spaniards in this time, but many of them were still intact. Slowly but surely, he finally entered the only floor he hadn't. Victory seemed close at hand, but Lionel knew that the chief priest was currently in the greatest danger now. He had led enough football comebacks to know that people were the most vulnerable when they believed victory was at hand. So, Lionel chose to watch silently behind a false wall. He had found this tunnel long ago but had never exited it. There was no point. He couldn't communicate with the Mayans since he couldn't speak their language, so it was better if he helped from the shadows. But who knew that the first things Lionel would see was an old man with wrinkled brown skin, standing over the body of a youthful beauty who seemed to be trying her best not to cry. Her nude form could just barely be seen by Lionel, as could the knife the chief priest held high in the air as he chanted something he couldn't understand. Lionel was so stunned that his face drained of all color. That girl was about to die, and the reason she would was in part his fault. Had he no ta? No, that didn't make sense. Wouldn't her fate at the hands of the Spaniards be even worse? Just forget it. They're not real people anyway. Just finish the quest. Protect the chief priestat. Just protect the chief priestat. Before Lionel knew what he was doing, he had kicked down the false wall in a maddened rage. Guilt he had suppressed in his heart for months came spilling over in a bloody killing intent, built from the deaths of hundreds of Spaniards. His left arm reached into the container of long darts, his right gripping his atlatls as he hooked in his first attack. Die! This was the first time in Lionel's life he truly wanted to kill. Even with Conrad, his intent hadn't truly been there. But the result was far beyond his expectations. The chanting priest turned toward him with a stunned expression, but reacted quickly, a barrier of something Lionel couldn't see appearing to block the piercing spear. Lionel stood frozen. Chief priest! Strength, 0.12, speed, 0.13, agility, 0.15, coordination, 0.42, stamina, 0.33. Not only was the priest's reaction the highest Lionel had ever seen aside from his own, it was the highest score Lionel had ever given, period. On top of this, Lionel suddenly felt that he was missing a seventh categoria. Just what was that wall of energy? Chapter 13. Priest. The chief priest wore a tall head guard, beautifully decorated in all sorts of bright feathers and fabrics. His chest was bare except for the cape that hung across his collarbone with finely polished jewels and precious metals. His lower body was covered by a skirt which first wrapped around him like a loincloth before extending into two long pieces between his legs that stopped just below his knees. He had no weapons aside from the crude sacrificial dagger that seemed formed of obsidian. However, he still felt like the most dangerous opponent he had ever come across. The priest began to speak words Lionel had no ability to understand. Still, the latter's nerves remained tight, whatever senses he had honed to this point being pushed to their upper limits. The strain even caused blood vessels in his eyes to burst, coloring his whites in red. With little more hesitation, Lionel knocked another at Ladle's dart. This time he used more power, pulling back with as much as 50% of his strength. Out of habit, he hadn't gone all out with the first strike because the physical stats of the priest were so low. But now he knew this wasn't a normal enemy. Seeing that his attempts at communication failed, the priest's brows furrowed as he raised his dagger once more. But this time, he aimed it toward Lionel, chanting with a calm rhythm. The nude young lady strapped to the table watched on blankly, her gaze, once filled with fear, turning dull. She seemed to believe that no matter how this all ended, her fate was already sealed. Lionel's spear shattered against an invisible barrier once more, but this time Lionel could faintly feel it condensing. It wasn't a feeling as sharp as his touch, sight, or hearing, but it was there. A sixth sense? Suddenly Lionel dropped down at his fastest speed. A moment later, a loud boom shook the sacrificial room's wall, leaving a deep impact. A cold sweat matted Lionel's back as he hopped up, sprinting to the side as he knocked another dart. He dove forward, sliding his arm across the air sideways and causing another dart to whistle across the air with a sharp sound. Damn it, I thought I would only have to fight normal humans in this place. Could it be that ancient humans found these awakened abilities too? Or maybe is it that these sub-dimensional zones aren't as historically accurate as I originally believed? Anomaly detected. Recalculating. A sub-dimensional zone detected. Mayan tomb. Spanish invasion. Sub-dimensional zone grade. C. Clear requirements. Enter chief priest's sacrificial room. Complete. Save chief priest. Side quest. Unable to detect. Scope of system 2 limited. Side quest. Defeat 100 Spaniards. Complete. On reward pending. No. Recalculating. No. Side quest. Unable to detect. Scope of system 2 limited. Side quest. Defeat 1,000 Spaniards. Complete. Reward pending. Recalculating. Hidden quest. Defeat the chief priest. Recalculating. Reward upgraded. Reward and trying. Able to detect. Scope of system 2 limited. It is recommended that subject Lionel Morales complete this quest with a minimum of 3 other individuals. Subject's D-grade abilities too low. For a moment, Lionel almost forgot his rage toward the priest. He wanted nothing more than to throw this broken watch across the walls till it broke. How was this considered a system? How could it be anything other than a jumbled mess? Instead of telling him that he should enter in a team of 4, it waited until it was already too late to tell him. Instead of telling him what the side quests were, it waited until he had already completed them to tell him. And it couldn't even get the grade of this sub-dimensional zone right. What absolute bullshit. Forget it. Focus. Moran. Lionel's father's note told him that his father had to suppress his awakening during his youth. What if other people besides him had experienced this as well? The only problem with this theory was that his father had also said his constitution was different than others saw. But who was to say there weren't others like him? Lionel's dart was blocked once more, but his sharp senses caught the fact the priest was forced to slide back, albeit a minuscule amount. With a flip, Lionel took advantage of his own centrifugal force, landing on his feet and not losing a single dart carried on his back. I only have 47 more darts. If I can't see any results by the time I have 25, I need to take the risk and get closer. Then what do I? Lionel maintained his strength perfectly, never using more than 50%. He realized that this priest was entirely reliant on his odd energy. The old man, getting on in years, didn't make any large movements. Aside from shifting his feet every so often to face Lionel and raising his arms, he did nothing else. It can't be endless. I don't believe that he can do this forever. Nay. Suddenly, Lionel felt a strong sense of danger from his back. Immediately he knew he had made a mistake. He dodged the priest's last strike, but he hadn't heard a loud boom to his back like he had heard every time previously. He hadn't accounted for the possibility that the priest could control the trajectory of his attacks. Lionel managed to leap out of the way just in time, but his pack of long darts didn't survive. The sound of splintering wood followed the ugly expression Lionel wore. Just like that, the 40-some-odd darts he had left were shattered to pieces, leaving the priest grinning an ugly yellow-toothed smile. Lionel sprung upward a moment later, running for his life. Without having to divert his attention toward Lionel's darts, the priest completely unleashed his strength. Lionel dodged like a madman, sprinting around the room as though he was on a racetrack and not in a temple. His mind spun, trying to think of solutions. First important point, every strike takes 2 seconds to charge and fire. Second important point, it only seems possible to control one strike at once. Controlled strikes take 5 seconds to charge, but can be prepared as lesser strikes are being fired. However, a normal energy strike cannot be formed while the controlled strike is being maneuvered. Third important point, these strikes carry a strength of 0.82. I should adjust his strength before I figure out how to rank this 7th category. The speed of these energy strikes is at 0.89. The agility of the controlled strikes are only at 0.46. If I want to keep surviving, I need to dodge before he sends out his strike or I'm finished. Luckily, I've overestimated the priest's coordination. If his control over his energy strikes are factored in, it's dropped by 0.03 to 0.39. Lionel continued to run, taking out 3 silver rods he had strapped to his left hip and twisting them together, discarding his atlatl completely. In a smooth motion, he shrugged off what remained of the box of darts, leaving about 20 pounds behind. Gripping his silver rod, Lionel abruptly changed directions. The moment he ducked the most recent controlled energy strike, he leaped into the air toward the chief priest, his silver rod morphing into a bicycle before he landed on the ground. The priest was stunned for a moment. Where could he have ever seen such technology? Luckily for Lionel, his silver rod worked with folding technology and not electrical technology, or it would have lost its morphing ability long ago. The sacrificial room was quite large, being about 200 meters in diameter. The distance between Lionel and the priest was currently just over 100 meters. Even if he ran full tilt, it would still take him over 9 seconds to make it. However, with some momentum built up in his bike, he could cut it to 8. 1 second, 2. Lionel tilted his bike to the side so far that his knee scraped against the ground. Sparks flew as the metal fitting he placed over it skid. With an abnormal feat of strength, Lionel slammed his palm into the ground, pushing himself and his bike back upright. He had fought with his life on the line for too long to feel the same shuddering nervousness. There had been nothing but him and his own thoughts for months. There was no way he was going to lose to the first person he consciously chose to kill. The next strike will very likely target my bike itself, too. Lionel's thighs flexed, his bike hopping just over a meter in the air. His instincts from countless battles kicked in. All things considered, only having to account for just one opponent at a time was marginally easier despite the godlike abilities of this priest. Here it comes. Yin Viao. The controlled strike finished charging, shooting toward Lionel like a bullet. Vaguely formed in Lionel's head, he could see the difference almost as though they were vibrant colors of their own. His eyes were slowly gaining the ability to see the shifting energy through the air, the pale fog circulating around the priest. Maybe if this was really a game and not real life, Lionel would get a notification achievement about awakening this level of sight before even gaining mastery over the energy. The energy sped toward him. But this time, it was no longer a vague feeling Lionel got. He could see it cutting through the air from his right, curving for his head while slicing down in an arching path. If Lionel jumped, it would destroy his bike. If he ducked, it would take off his head. The priest likely realized that Lionel was previously only able to get a vague sense of where his energy was coming from, due to the fact Lionel had taken more drastic actions than what was necessary. Not only did he start taking control of the energy strike before it met Lionel this time, but he also actively dissipated its energy, trying to confuse Lionel about its exact location. Unfortunately, the priest could have never imagined that Lionel's senses would evolve once more at this very moment. Even more unfortunately, Lionel was well aware how low the agility of the controlled energy strike was. Lionel suddenly skidded his bike to a grinding halt, the tail of his back wheel spinning to the front and whipping around. His maneuver was perfectly timed. The controlled strike sped by his right side across his face and out into the distance toward the left. The priest's eyes widened as he quickly tried to control the energy strike to turn back, but Lionel's bike had already finished its spin and furiously sped forward. Though in a straight line, the energy strike had a speed of 0.89, and Lionel's speed was only 0.51. There were two important factors Lionel had already considered. First, the time it took for the energy strike to slow, turn around, then gain its top speed once more was long due to its low agility. And, second, Lionel's speed on his bike obviously just wasn't a mere 0.51 anymore. The priest was too late to realize this. Lionel was already 2 seconds away and he still hadn't abandoned his controlled energy strike. He didn't have enough time to prepare another strike. In a panic, the priest grabbed the naked girl on the table and threw her toward Lionel, who had just unsheathed a sword. Shocked, Lionel squeezed the handbrakes of his bike as hard as he could, catching the girl in the air. Damn it! Analyzing the situation, Lionel knew his time-sensitive plan was ruined. He also realized something else. The priest's strength was too low to throw a girl who must have weighed at least 110 pounds across 10 meters to him. That meant the priest had another method of amplifying the strength of his body directly. In that instant, the priest's strength stat rose to 0.97. The priest still doesn't know I attacked him to protect this girl. If he knows this, he'll use it against me. Namate. Lionel recovered from his apprehension quickly. Battle instincts he had honed for months kicking in as he apologetically dropped the girl to the ground without hesitation. It might have been cruel, but a drop of less than a meter was better than whatever attack she would have to suffer from the priest otherwise. His plan worked just as intended. The priest completely ignored the girl, believing that Lionel wouldn't care about her life one way or another. However, by now he had already prepared another strike. Lionel clicked the button on his bike, turning it back into a pole and rolling out of the way. It was already too late to build up momentum with his bike again. He had to cross the last few meters himself.